My name is Anna. It's not the name my parents gave me, but it's the name I chose when I decided to follow a new path, a path that led me straight to the arms of Jesus. Before that, I was known as Amina, daughter of Mariam Hassan, who belonged to one of the most respected families in Maldives. Today I'm 25, but what I've experienced feels like part of another existence, as if it belonged to someone I'm no longer. I grew up in a place that to many seems like a true paradise. Islands surrounded by crystal clear waters, coconut trees swaying in the ocean breeze, and breathtaking sunsets. But behind all this beauty, there was a life marked by fear, silence, and many rules. The Maldives are beautiful, yes, but for me, they were like a gilded cage. I was always smiling on the outside, but inside, I felt lost. I learned from an early age to hide my feelings, to keep quiet about what I thought, to be what was expected of me. My house was beautiful, decorated with light curtains that swayed in the wind, and pillows embroidered by my grandmother. But even the beauty of those objects carried a weight. The strong smell of burning incense in the morning made me nauseous, reminding me of the prayers I was forced to repeat mechanically, even without fully understanding why. My childhood was marked by silent footsteps, warning glances, and a constant feeling of being watched, even inside my own home. My father was a fisherman, but also a man of religious influence. He was strict, disciplined, and feared. Faith, in our home, wasn't a source of peace. It was a duty. It was law. My mother, in turn, was the epitome of obedience. She wore the hijab with pride and taught that women should be modest, submissive, like a pearl hidden at the bottom of the sea, as she used to say. I never saw her raise her voice, but her look spoke volumes, especially when I asked too many questions or when my curiosity showed in my expression. I grew up shaped by a system that controlled not only my steps, but also my thoughts. From a young age, I was taught that there was only one path, one truth, one religion. Being Muslim wasn't a choice. It was the only option, and any other path was considered treason. At just 5 years old, I was already repeating phrases I didn't understand, praying prayers I didn't feel, and following traditions that often made me uneasy, but which I didn't dare question. But even there, in that environment where everything seemed defined and unquestionable, something inside me began to awaken. It was small, like a spark, a doubt, a uneasiness, a thirst for something more. I didn't know its name yet, but today I understand it was the Spirit of God beginning to call me. Since I was a child, prayer was part of my routine, like the steps we take without thinking. 5 times a day, my family and I would spread our rugs on the cold coral floor of our house, facing Mecca. The dawn prayer, Fajr, was the one that moved me the most. There was something heavy about that moment, still in the dark, while the city slept, and our voices echoed in a deep, repetitive chant. What they claimed was a connection with God often felt to me like an empty cry, almost a stifled scream. During Ramadan, everything intensified. Fasting, long periods of prayer, readings from the Quran, which I knew almost by heart, filled our days. There was discipline, there was surrender, but there was no peace. For a while, I thought it was faith, but as the years passed, I began to notice small cracks. The feeling that something was wrong grew silently within me, like a seed sprouting in the darkness. That faith I had been taught was absolute began to feel fragile. The promised peace never arrived, and the answers never came. In the Maldives, there is no room for questioning. Being Christian, for example, is not only forbidden, it's considered a crime. The state demands that every citizen be Muslim. There is no what if, there is no choice. The Bible is treated as contraband. The cross is a forbidden symbol, and mentioning Jesus in a way other than what Islam allows can cost you your freedom, or even your life. While tourists wander the islands with their beliefs and books, we, the children of those lands, are forced to live trapped in a single story. At school, I learned what I was allowed to learn. Subjects were filtered through a single lens. At home, surveillance was constant. My mother read my notebooks, supervised my conversations, and even controlled my emotions. I couldn't dream too big. I couldn't show sadness, anger, or curiosity beyond the norm. But there was one place where I could escape, even if only for a short time: the ocean. The beaches were the only place where I felt I could breathe. The sound of the waves, the touch of the water on my feet, the smell of salt in the air. All of it reminded me that there was something bigger out there. It was there, facing the vast blue expanse, that I began to ask silent, dangerous questions. I didn't say them out loud, not even in clear thought, but they came. Is there another way? Is God really this distant judge, ready to punish me for any mistake? Is there a God who truly loves me? These questions scared me. I knew I couldn't share them with anyone. I knew that if my family found out, my life could change overnight. But even though I was scared, I couldn't keep that uneasiness at bay any longer. When I was 17, my father took me to a special ceremony at Malay's Central Mosque. It was an imposing building with a golden dome that gleamed in the sun. Inside, men and women were divided by a curtain, as if they belonged to different worlds. The imam spoke of submission, duty, and punishment, but the words, instead of touching me, passed through me like wind. For the first time, I realized something was very wrong, not with the words themselves, but with the emptiness they left. I returned home that day with a tightness in my chest, and that night, lying in bed, listening to the whisper of the waves and looking up at the sky through the cracks in the window, something in me shifted. For the first time in my life, I didn't say my traditional prayer. Instead, I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered something different. A prayer, not like the ones I'd learned, but like a cry for help, light and sincere, thrown to the wind. If there is a God who sees me, who loves me, show me who you are. That night, when I whispered to the wind that I just wanted to know the truth, I had no idea God would actually listen. I never imagined the answer would come in such an unexpected form, with a foreign accent, eyes as blue as the sea I loved, and a story that would turn my world upside down. It was as if the universe had heard my prayer and begun moving the pieces, little by little, until everything made sense. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to experience truth with a capital T, not as a system, a list of rules, or an imposed religion, but as a person. 3 months after that solitary prayer, he began to reveal himself. It was March 2019. High season brought throngs of tourists to the Maldives, and like many girls my age, I worked in the tourism industry. I was a snorkeling guide at a small local center. This job for me was more than just a job. It was freedom. In the sea, I was free. No one told me to lower my eyes, cover my hair, or measure my words. Underwater, among the colorful reefs and the silent ballet of the fish, I could just be me. It was there, in the place where I felt most alive, that God began to answer me. I met Marco during one of the excursions to Ari Atoll. He was an Italian dive instructor, maybe in his early 30s, with hair tousled by the salty wind and a smile that seemed unhurried. He had recently arrived as part of an exchange program between dive centers. From the start, there was something different about him, not just his appearance, but his calmness, as if he were always at peace, even in silence. We first spoke on the boat, returning from a dive. While the tourists were reviewing their manta ray photos, Marco approached me as I was packing up my gear. "The corals here are out of this world," he said, in English marked by a light, almost musical accent. "It's like God painted an underwater garden." That word, God, caught me off guard. It wasn't spoken as a command or a warning, but as a compliment, almost a sigh. He didn't say Allah, as I was used to hearing. He said God, and there was tenderness in that sound. "Yes, it's very beautiful," I replied, trying to hide my discomfort. Marco continued, calmly taking off his diving mask. "Have you ever stopped to think about how all of this is too perfect to have happened by chance? Every fish, every detail in the coral, every current, everything seems made with care, as if there were love behind it." I didn't know what to say. His words were simple, but they resonated within me with unexpected power. I'd heard about God all my life, a God who demands, exacts, punishes. But here was someone speaking about God with ease, as if he truly knew him. And more than that, as if he were good. "In your country," I began hesitantly, "what is this faith like?" Marco smiled, not the kind of smile someone tries to convince. It was more like someone remembering something precious. "Where I grew up, we learned that God is Father, that he created all of this. Yes, the sea, the fish, the stars. But what he loves most are people. He loves them so much that he sent his son to show us this love up close, to rescue us." He spoke with a freedom I'd never seen before. There was no fear in his eyes. There was no tension in his words. For the first time in my life, I saw someone speak of God without a burden on their shoulders, without obligation, without fear of making mistakes, just with love. I didn't know it yet, but at that moment, even without using his name, Marco was introducing me to Jesus. In my country, there are many ways to see God, Marco said calmly, almost as if telling a personal story. But I believe in Jesus. At that moment, the name sounded different to me. Jesus. Not Isa, the prophet mentioned in the Quran, but Jesus. He didn't say it with doubt or as part of an argument. He said it with gentle firmness, as if speaking of someone he knows, not just believes. For me, God is not a distant force issuing rules from heaven, he continued. God came to us. He walked among us. He cried with us. He truly loved us. This God has a name, Jesus. That name echoed within me like a bell tolling underwater, muffled, but impossible to ignore. I'd grown up hearing that Isa was a prophet, yes, but a limited human, submissive one. The idea that he could be God seemed absurd to me, or rather, forbidden. And yet, the way Marco spoke, the sparkle in his eyes, the freedom in his voice, everything told me there was something in that story I'd never heard before. Tell me more, I whispered, looking around to make sure no one was listening, and he did. All the way back on the boat, Marco spoke to me about a God who cares, who touched the untouchables, who forgave those the world rejected, who looked upon women with dignity, a God who didn't come to bind us with rules, but to free our hearts. He spoke of Jesus with disarming simplicity. But isn't that blasphemy? I blurted out, as if my mind wanted to shield my soul from what it was beginning to yearn to hear. Marco looked at me, confused, but not judgmental. Why would it be blasphemy to believe that God loves us so much that he would draw close to us, to the point of suffering for us? That question lingered in my mind for days. It was as if he'd placed a stone in the center of a lake. The ripples of that question rolled over me endlessly. At night, lying in bed, the sound of the ocean wafting through the window, I wondered, why would love be an offense? Why would a God who sacrifices himself for love be less worthy than one who demands sacrifices? In the days that followed, Marco and I went on several excursions together. With each dive, with each conversation, I felt like someone exploring an underwater cave full of unknown chambers. And in each chamber, a light, a new thought, a new possibility. He spoke to me about the Bible, about the parables of Jesus, about a faith built on love, not fear, on freedom, not control. Where I grew up, he said one day, as we floated over a coral garden, women can be leaders in the church. They can study the Bible. They can preach. They can speak to God without intermediaries, with freedom. This idea resonated deeply with me. In the Maldives, women pray behind men. They remain silent. Their voices are muffled, their opinions ignored. The mere thought of a woman speaking about God in front of others seemed so radical it made me dizzy. And Jesus, what does he think about women? I asked weakly. Marco smiled. For Jesus, there is no difference between man and woman, slave or free, rich or poor. We are all beloved children. One afternoon, while we were exploring an old shipwreck near Vavu Atoll, Marco asked me a question that struck a chord. Amina, are you happy with your faith? It was so direct, so simple, that it left me speechless. No one had ever asked me that. Faith, for me, was never about happiness. It was about obedience, about duty, about fear. I don't know, I replied, as if the words were welling up from deep within me, like bubbles rising to the surface. Faith should bring peace, he said gently. Joy, hope. If it only brings fear and guilt, maybe it's not true faith. That night I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. His words repeated in my mind like the echo of an ancient voice I'd always ignored, but which now I could no longer silence. Was I happy, or was I just surviving? Have I ever known true peace? Or have I simply lived my entire life afraid of making mistakes before a distant and harsh God? Before dawn, I got out of bed and walked to the beach. The sky was still dark, but there was a faint glow on the horizon. My feet sank into the damp sand. The wind was cool, and there, with the sound of the waves gently crashing before me, I closed my eyes, and for the second time in my life, truly prayed. But this time, not to the God of fear. This time, to the God of hope that I didn't even fully know yet. Jesus, if it's you, show me. The stars were still shining over the sea when, for the first time, I spoke to God as if he were a friend, not a judge. The cool dawn breeze touched my face, and my words were more sincere than any prayer I had ever prayed before. "If you really love me," I murmured, staring at the horizon, "then show me the truth. I don't care if it hurts. I don't care if it's dangerous. I just want to know the real you." And it was at that moment that something happened. I heard no voice. There was no light in the sky, no miraculous sign. But inside me, a peace, a calm so deep, so strange, so beautiful, it seemed to come from another world. It was as if, for a moment, everything I was, fear, doubt, heaviness, confusion, had been silenced, like sand settling at the bottom of the sea. I didn't know, at that moment, that prayer marked the beginning of a journey that would transform everything. My faith, my worldview, my relationship with my family, my name, everything. I didn't know that this truth I so desperately prayed for would come at such a high cost that some nights in the future I would wonder if it was worth it. But there, with my feet dug into the wet sand, listening to the whisper of the waves, I already knew there was no turning back. The seed Marco had planted with his words, simple, almost innocent, was beginning to sprout within me. I couldn't yet see the tree, but the roots were spreading, touching layers of my heart that had never been reached before. The search for truth had begun, and it would lead me down paths that would reveal both the darkest and brightest parts of my soul. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It wasn't like a bolt of lightning striking the sky. It was like the tide, slow, steady, patiently shaping the shore. With each conversation with Marco, a piece of the puzzle of my faith fell into place. The questions I'd harbored since I was a child, which I'd often swallowed in fear, were now beginning to find answers. Not in pre-packaged speeches, but in small discoveries, in truths whispered with love. Marco carried a small Bible, barely the size of his hand, wrapped in plastic and tucked into the bottom of his diving backpack. In the Maldives, being caught with a Bible meant arrest, perhaps worse, and yet he carried it with him, not out of boldness, but because to him it was more valuable than air itself. Some afternoons, when the boat returned empty after diving, and we were alone with the sea, Marco would open it and read to me. "Listen to this," he said one day, his voice almost drowned out by the boat's engine. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." That the words hit me with a force I hadn't expected. It was as if they had been written just for me. All my life, I've known a God who demands, who expects blind obedience, who counts my mistakes as if each one were a stone in my backpack. A God before whom I only bow, never approach. But now, there was a God who called, who reached out, who demanded no rest, but offered. "Is that really what it says?" I asked, almost breathless. "Is that what Jesus said?" "It's him," Marco replied with a gleam in his eyes. "It's not a heavy religion, Amina. It's an invitation, a call to freedom." That word, freedom, echoed inside me like the song of a whale at the bottom of the ocean. Large, mysterious, beautiful, and dangerous. Freedom. It wasn't a common word among women in my culture. Freedom for us was like a foreign dream, a concept we were taught to fear, something that needed to be suppressed before it led us to sin. "But I'm a woman," I said, almost instinctively. Years of silence had taught me that freedom wasn't for me. Marco didn't respond with pity. He didn't try to console me. He just smiled, as if he knew something I was yet to discover. "Amina, for Jesus, there is no difference between man and woman, between those who command and those who serve, between those who are seen and those who are hidden. We are all children, all loved equally." I remained silent, because deep down, I wanted to believe it. I wanted it to be true, that there was a God who saw me, in truth, who knew me, who valued me, not as an obedient shadow, but as a daughter. And for the first time, I began to imagine that maybe this God really existed, and that he was calling me by name. Marco closed the little Bible and looked at me with a gaze so deep that it seemed to pierce the silence of the sea and reach something hidden inside me. "Jesus spoke to a woman," he said, his voice calm, almost reverent. "A Samaritan woman, alone, by a well, rejected by society, considered impure, and it was to her that he revealed for the first time that he was the Messiah." I couldn't even breathe properly. His words broke through my defenses, breaking down walls I didn't even know I'd built. "And do you know who was the first person to see the resurrected Jesus?" he continued. "A woman, Mary Magdalene. In the kingdom of God, women are not second-class citizens. That took me apart. All my life, I accepted, without ever questioning, that my worth was less, that my voice needed to be muffled, that my prayers were only valuable if they first passed through a man's mouth. I was trained for this from a young age. The idea that God could see me as equal, as worthy, as someone worthy of direct revelation. It was like a giant wave crashing over me. I started crying, uncontrollably. In the middle of that boat, in the middle of the sea, as if everything that was trapped inside me had finally found a way to escape. "Why are you crying?" Marco asked softly, sweetly. "Because," I tried to speak, swallowing back tears, "because no one ever told me I could talk to God like that." It was true. Never, not once, had I been taught that I could approach God as a daughter. I was always told that I was less, that my presence needed to be mediated, that God only listened to the pure, and pure in my culture almost always meant man. Marco then took my hand, and even though I knew that, in my culture, that gesture would be scandalous, at that moment, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Amina, you are a child of God," he said firmly. "He knows your name. He knows every tear you've ever shed. He's heard every question you've ever whispered to the wind. You don't need intermediaries. Jesus is the way, and that way is open for you." That night, for the first time in my life, the hour of Jesus. It was a confused prayer, unsure, full of fear, full of silence. But there was a hope there, raw, almost desperate, that had been buried beneath years of religious obligations and soulless rules. Lying in my room, my heart pounding, I spoke in a low voice. "Jesus, if you really are who Marco says you are, if you love me like he says, then show me. I don't care what the cost is. I just want to know the truth." I didn't expect an immediate answer, nor signs in the sky. I just wanted feel something real. And what came was not noise, nor exaggerated emotion. It was peace, a warm, silent kind of peace, like warm water spreading over the body after a swim. A rest that none of my formal prayers had ever given me. In the following days, my life became a whirlwind of discoveries. Marco lent me his Bible. I hid it like a diamond. I slept with it under my pillow, read it at night by the light of my cell phone, always in secret, my heart racing. Each page was like oxygen, like bread for a soul that was starving. I read about Jesus touching women, speaking to them as equals, healing, defending, freeing. I read about him forgiving sinners, eating with outcasts, challenging the hypocrisy of the religious. I read about his death and understood for the first time that it was not a defeat. He was voluntary sacrifice for love. I read about his resurrection, about the promise of eternal life, and most unbelievable, a life that didn't need to be earned through works or rituals, but received by grace. Each verse was like a key opening a door inside me, doors I didn't even know existed. And then, for the first time in my life, I understood what Marco meant by joy of salvation. But along with this joy also came the weight of reality. Every prayer I said to Jesus, every page I read of the Bible was, according to the law of my country, a crime. In the Maldives, abandoning Islam is considered treason. To the faith, to the culture, to the homeland. Conversion to Christianity means imprisonment, exile, or in some cases death. There is no legal space for churches. There is no protection, only silence and fear, and I knew it. And yet, I couldn't stop, because now, I had known the truth. One stuffy night, tucked under the covers, I silently read the Gospel of John, the dim glow of my cell phone hidden between the sheets. Each word burned within me with something I could only describe as life. But that intimate moment was interrupted by the sound of light footsteps in the hallway. My heart nearly stopped. In a silent panic, I slid the Bible under my mattress and turned off my phone in one swift motion. I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep, even though my heart was pounding so loudly, it seemed to vibrate the air around me. The door creaked slightly. It was my mother. "Amina?" she whispered from the doorway. "Is everything okay with you? You've been different." "I'm fine, Mom," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Just tired from work." She stood there for what felt like hours, then walked away silently. But inside, I was far from okay. I was becoming someone my own family wouldn't recognize. Someone they, to them, would consider a threat. I was meeting a God they would come to consider an enemy. In the days that followed, my mind was in constant conflict. I was caught between two worlds. The home I'd grown up in, with its rigid rules and imposed faith, and the new life Jesus had awakened within me, a life full of grace, truth, and freedom. Marco noticed my inner heaviness. One afternoon, after a dive where we were lucky enough to see a pod of dolphins playing around us, he approached me on the boat. "You've decided, haven't you?" he asked bluntly. I knew exactly what he meant. "Yes," I replied firmly. I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he died for me and rose again. This is the truth I have sought all my life." Marco smiled, but not lightly. There was concern in his eyes. "Do you know what this could cost you?" I nodded with teary eyes. "I know, but after knowing the truth, how could I return to the darkness?" He looked at me with respect and seriousness. "Then you need to be extremely careful, Amina, much more so than you have been." But I was about to discover that even with all the caution in the world, some truths simply reveal themselves, and when they do, they are unstoppable. My mother, with her ever-watchful eye and keen intuition, began to notice small changes. My way of praying was quieter, less automatic. My answers about faith, which I had previously repeated with conviction, now sounded hesitant. "There's something different about you," she said one morning as I made coffee. Her gaze pierced mine, trying to read me. "Your prayers are no longer alive. I'm just tired," I lied again, clinging to that excuse like a buoy in the open sea. But lies are like bubbles at the bottom of the ocean. They rise, and when they reach the surface, they burst, always. The confrontation was inevitable. I could feel it in the air, like the approach of a distant storm. I was no longer the daughter they had raised. I belonged to another father. And following this new path meant being willing to face anything. Because believing in Jesus in the Maldives isn't just a spiritual choice, it's a sentence. And I was about to discover the weight of that decision. The betrayal happened in such a small detail that it seemed impossible. One Thursday morning, a little over 3 months after my conversion, as I was preparing for another day of diving, my cell phone ran out of battery. Without thinking, I left the device charging on the kitchen table while I ran to take a shower. That was all. But it was enough to change everything. That morning, fate hid itself in a trivial detail. My mother was cleaning the kitchen while I showered when she heard a notification coming from my phone. The device was charging on the table. In the Maldives, privacy for daughters doesn't exist. Mothers check messages without asking, and this has always been part of our routine. But that day, the phone ringing was like a trigger. The message was from Marco. We had agreed on discrete codes to talk about faith, so no one would suspect. But that day, in a fit of carelessness and enthusiasm, he didn't use any code. The screen glowed with an explicit verse, "For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." John 3:16. May this verse bless you today, sister in Christ. My mother read it once, then again, and again. With each reading, I imagined the horror growing inside her, like ink spreading through water. Sister in Christ, those forbidden words burned like fire on the screen. When I emerged from the shower, I found my mother sitting at the table, holding my phone in trembling hands. Her face was a mask of shock and pain, a face I had never seen before. "Amina," she said, her voice deep, almost unrecognizable. "What is this?" My heart froze. I saw my phone on the table, and on it the verse that had brought me so much peace. Now those words were proof of my crime. "Mom," I started, but my voice didn't come out. "Are you a Christian?" The question was filled with horror, each syllable a weight on me. The silence that followed was suffocating. In that instant, I could see 2 lives drifting apart, hers and mine, like ocean currents pulling in opposite directions. I took a deep breath. "Yes," I whispered, and the word dropped through the air like a stone in deep water. She stood up so suddenly that her chair fell backward. Her face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, shock, anger, and finally, something that cut me more than anything: disgust. "You betrayed," he shouted. "You betrayed your family, your country, everything we are." Tears streamed down my face, not from regret, but from the pain of the chasm that had opened between us. "Mom, I found the truth." My voice trembled, but it was firm. "I found Jesus. He gave me a peace I never knew in Islam." She took a step back, as if my words were blows. "Blasphemy," he shouted. "How can you say such a thing in this house?" "Because it's the truth," I replied, feeling a new strength within me. "Jesus died for me, Mom. He loves me without me needing to earn that love with rituals. He already gave it to me. The slap came so fast I didn't have time to react. The sound echoed through the kitchen like thunder, and pain seared my cheek. But that physical pain was nothing compared to what I saw in my mother's eyes. A deep emptiness, a cold ache that seemed to have no return. "You are not my daughter," my mother said, her cold voice cutting through my chest like a blade. "My daughter was Muslim. My daughter loved Allah. You are a stranger, an infidel." She turned and walked heavily to her bedroom, not looking at me. I stood in the kitchen, holding my cheek, still hot from the slap, knowing something had been broken forever. The sound of her door closing behind her echoed through the house like a tomb being sealed. For the next few hours, I heard murmurs coming from her room, hurried phone calls, low voices. It was like listening to a sentence being written with words I couldn't stop. She was consulting the authorities. She was asking for guidance on what to do with the daughter she considered a traitor. My father came home earlier than usual that afternoon. He looked older, more frail, as if he'd aged years in a few hours. He sat across from me in the living room, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the floor. "Your mother told me what she discovered," he said hoarsely. "Tell me it's not true, Amina. Please tell me it's a misunderstanding." I took a deep breath. "I can't say that, Dad, because it would be a lie." He closed his eyes, as if my words were physical pain. "Do you know what this means? Do you know what you did to this family?" "I have found the truth, Father," I replied, my voice trembling but firm. "I have found God." "You've met with condemnation," he snapped, standing up suddenly. "In the Maldives, being a Christian is a crime. Do you know what they do to people like you? Do you know what they can do to us? For having you under our roof?" For the first time, I felt the full weight of my choice. I hadn't just put my life at risk. I had put my entire family at risk. Here, harboring an apostate was a crime. Protecting a convert could mean imprisonment or exile. "You can leave," my father finally said, almost in a desperate whisper. "We can pretend you're going to study abroad. You can practice your new faith far away, in secret." I looked at him with teary eyes. "I will not hide, Father. I will not live in the shadows because I love Jesus." I saw something break inside him. Tears welled up in his eyes. "So you leave me no choice," he muttered, defeated. That night, I heard my mother make the phone call that would seal my fate. From my bedroom, each word fell to me like a blade. My daughter, apostasy, evidence on her cell phone. Yes, we need help. We can't handle this alone. The woman who gave me life, who cared for me during the fevers of childhood, now handed me over to the authorities for the crime of having found God. I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit ocean. I prayed to Jesus with a desperation I'd never known. "Jesus," I whispered, "I know you said following you could tear families apart, that it would bring conflict, but it hurts more than I imagined. Give me strength for what comes next. Don't leave me alone." Out on the horizon, small fishing boats were returning to the island, their lights blinking in the darkness. I clung to that vision like a symbol. Even in the darkest night, there is still light. Around 5 a.m, I heard vehicles approaching, doors slamming, footsteps on the chorus path, official male voices. The moment had arrived. My mother walked into my room, her face set in a strange mixture of determination and deep sadness. "They came for you," she said calmly, almost as if speaking an unavoidable truth. "It's best not to resist." I dressed slowly, each movement filled with a calm I tried to force myself to feel. Before leaving the room, I took the small cross Marco had secretly given me, a delicate piece of coral, hand-carved during one of our dives. I closed my hand around it, holding tightly to the symbol of faith that now accompanied me like a silent amulet. In the living room, 2 police officers were waiting for me, along with a cleric I recognized immediately, Imam Rashid, the man from the central mosque. Their faces were serious, professional, but there was something else in the cleric's eyes, a bitter curiosity. It wasn't every day that a young woman from the Maldives was arrested for converting to Christianity. "Amina Hassan," one of the officers said, formally reading from a piece of paper. "You are under arrest on suspicion of apostasy from Islam and activities against the Islamic faith. You have the right to remain silent." I looked at my mother one last time. She was crying, but they weren't tears of regret for what she had done. They were tears of loss, for the daughter she had known, for the daughter who, to her mind, had given herself over to a foreign faith. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said softly, my voice breaking. I'm sorry for the pain this causes, but I don't regret finding Jesus. Those were the last words I exchanged with her as a free woman. As they led me to the police car, I saw the neighbors peering out their windows, their expressions curious and judgmental. Word would spread quickly. The Hassan's daughter had converted, and her own mother had turned her into the authorities. As the city of Malé disappeared through the car window, I pressed the cross against my palm until I felt the pressure mark on my skin. It was all I had of my faith, of my new identity, of the truth that now pulsed within me. I didn't yet know I was entering an ordeal that would test not only my body, but every inch of my soul. I didn't know the weeks ahead would test my faith against seemingly invincible storms. But even amid the fear and pain of family betrayal, there was a small flame, a flame that refused to die. Jesus had promised, "In this world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." I clung tightly to that promise, like a shipwrecked person clinging to a piece of driftwood in the open sea. The storm was just beginning, but I was no longer alone. The Malé police station smelled of sweat, cheap disinfectant, and hopelessness. I was seated on a plastic chair in a windowless room, under the bright, flickering light of a fluorescent bulb that seemed designed to drive anyone mad. The interrogation began immediately. 3 men took turns asking questions, alternating between open intimidation and faux paternal concern. The most prominent voice was that of Imam Rashid, an older man who seemed to enjoy every answer he gave. "Mom told us you're involved in Christian activities," he began, his tone sharp. "Explain that." My response was calm, despite the fear that gripped my chest. I found Jesus. He is the truth my heart was searching for. And there, in that cold, oppressive room, where justice seemed absent, I began to experience the greatest test of my faith, knowing that God was with me in every word, in every tear, and in every moment of solitude. "It must be a misunderstanding, right?" the officer said, his tone almost paternal, like someone trying to convince a rebellious child. "An intelligent girl like you couldn't have been seduced by a foreign religion." "It's not a misunderstanding," I replied, my voice sounding firmer than I felt inside. "I have found the truth in Jesus Christ." The effect was immediate. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, faces hardened, postures tensed. It was as if I had cast a curse rather than made a confession of faith. "Do you understand the gravity of what you're saying?" another officer asked, leaning forward, his eyes narrowed. "In the Maldives, apostasy is treason. Treason against the state, against society, against Allah himself." "I understand," I replied, keeping my gaze steady. "But I can't deny what I've experienced. Jesus gave me a peace I never found in Islam." Imam Rashid stood up abruptly, his face red with anger. "What you say is poison. It's shirk, associating other gods with Allah. Do you know what that means?" That was just the first of many explosions. For the next 6 hours, I was bombarded with questions, veiled threats, and lengthy quotations from the Quran. They wanted names. Who had converted me? Who else was involved? Were there secret meetings, Christian literature circulating around the country? I protected Marco with everything I had. "There must be someone behind this," the lead cop insisted, his voice growing harsher with each question. "Girls around here don't convert to Christianity on their own." "Who brainwashed you?" I took a deep breath. "No one brainwashed me. I found Jesus, and he found my heart." That statement triggered another hour of shouting, threats, and even attempts to use Bible verses out of context to prove Islam's superiority. But none of it could touch the peace I carried within. It was like waves crashing against a rock, loud, insistent, but incapable of moving what was firmly planted. When it finally got dark, I was taken to a small, damp cell at the back of the police station. The space barely fit a camp bed and a bucket that served as a toilet. The walls were stained with damp, and something I preferred not to identify. I sat on the bed, hugging my knees, and for the first time since my arrest, I let the tears flow. These weren't tears of regret for my faith. They were tears of loss. I had lost my family, my home, my place in the world. Everything that had felt safe had evaporated in a matter of hours. "Jesus," I whispered into the darkness. "Help me be strong. Help me remember that you too were rejected. You too suffered for speaking the truth." 3 days later, I was removed from the cell without any explanation. They only told me I would be part of a rehabilitation program to correct my religious deviation. Early in the morning, they placed me on a small boat. My hands were handcuffed, and 2 armed guards were on each side. The journey lasted 4 hours. The waters I once explored freely as a dive guide now became the bars of my prison, separating me from the world I knew and leading me to a destination I dreaded to imagine. The disciplinary island was a place that didn't exist to the outside world, a small isolated atoll over 100 kilometers from Malay, absent from any tourist map. It was the government's dirty secret, a repository of deviant souls where no one entered and left the same. Nothing here resembled the postcard-perfect Maldives. The main building was a weather-stained concrete block surrounded by rusty barbed wire. All around were sharp coral, salt water, and a constant wind that cut like blades, whispering warnings that seemed to come from the ocean itself. My cell was 2 meters by 3, with a narrow window overlooking the sea, and nothing else. A metal bed, a rusty table, a bucket. Food arrived twice a day, rice with dried fish, and water that tasted of salt and despair. But the true burden of the place wasn't physical, it was psychological. Every day a different cleric entered the cell to re-educate me. Hours and hours of sermons on the dangers of Christianity, the supposed lies of the Bible, the betrayal I had committed. One young cleric, his eyes alight with fanaticism, repeated, "Christianity is a corrupt religion. Jesus never claimed to be God. Christians have distorted his message." One afternoon, hoarse from listening and responding so much, I said, "If Jesus were just a prophet, why were his followers willing to die for him? Why did they claim to have seen his resurrection?" He shouted, "Lies. All lies fabricated by enemies of Islam." But no matter how loud their cries were, they couldn't reach what I had experienced within myself. I didn't know Jesus through books or arguments. I knew him because he had found me. No doctrine could erase that experience. The nights were the hardest. In the solitude of my cell, only the sound of the sea kept me company. Despair crept in like water seeping into the cracks of my faith. I asked myself in the darkness, was it worth it? Losing my family, my freedom, maybe my life? And I always remembered the first time I prayed to Jesus, the peace that filled my chest, the freedom of knowing I was loved unconditionally, and the answer was always the same. Yes, it's worth it, right here. I created a routine to survive. Every morning, before the clergy arrived, I would get up and stand at the little window, looking out at the sea and praying, not because I believed God was in the waters, but because that endless ocean reminded me of Christ's love, vast, deep, indomitable. Jesus, you walked on these waters. You calmed the storms. Calm the storm in my heart. Give me strength for another day. And the strength came. Not spectacularly, but like the tide slowly filling an empty lagoon. Each day I refused to renounce my faith was a small victory. Each whispered prayer was an act of resistance. The guards began to notice. Some looked curiously, others with what I could only call respect. An older guard named Fatima began sneaking me extra food. One night, as she passed a piece of bread between the bars, she whispered, "Why? Why don't you go back? One word from you would be enough, and all this would be over." I held the bread in my hands, looked into her eyes and said softly, "Because when you find the truth, you can no longer live in a lie." Fatima didn't answer. She just stared at me, as if she saw something she couldn't name. "Why don't you abandon this foreign religion? Go home, to your old life," she asked, with a mixture of frustration and pleading. I took a deep breath and replied firmly, "To me this religion isn't foreign. Jesus is my family now. He is my home." We stood there, staring at each other, and in that moment I could see a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "You have courage," she said finally. Foolish courage, perhaps, but courage. The weeks dragged on and turned into months. The isolation, the incessant sermons, the constant attempts to break me. Everything seemed to crush my spirit. But day after day, I resisted. And with each resistance, I felt more clearly Jesus' presence with me, his love far greater than any concrete wall or physical prison. One night, during a raging storm, I was lying on my bunk, listening to the wind roar like an enraged beast, when something made me jump. Footsteps, muffled voices, strange sounds coming from outside. I ran to the small window of my cell, and through the pouring rain, spotted a small, fast boat. Unlike the official government vessels, it looked more like a fishing boat, stealthy, trying to go unnoticed. Before I could process it, I heard the sound of keys turning in the door. I expected to see one of the usual guards, but to my astonishment, a strange man appeared, a drenched Westerner with urgent eyes. "Amina," he whispered in English. "I'm Marco's friend. We've come to get you out of here." For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. The months of captivity, the tension, everything seemed to have consumed me. But there he was, real, extending his hand, and with it, a hope that seemed to glow brightly within my chest. "Marco," I murmured, trying to convince myself this wasn't a dream. "Yes, everything's fine, but we need to get out, fast. The storm is covering us, but only just." I looked around the small cell that had been my world for so long. Inside, I learned to be strong. My faith, even in the darkest moments, never wavered. With a strange, almost nostalgic feeling, it seemed I was leaving behind not just a cell, but a piece of myself, forged between pain and prayer. Freedom called to me, with the promise of a life where I could live my faith in the light of day, without fear. "Let's go," I said, holding tightly the hand of the man who felt like an angel sent. I didn't yet know that the real challenge lay ahead, that escaping from there was only the beginning of a difficult path to finding complete freedom, a path where I would have to leave behind everything I had ever known as home. The storm raged outside, as if the raging ocean were trying to prevent my escape. The wind blew fiercely, shaking the concrete walls, while the rain lashed against the small window of the cell, as if the sky, too, mourned my departure. The man, who introduced himself as David, a Norwegian missionary working secretly in the region, moved with the calm and precision of someone who had planned everything long ago. Behind him came Fatima, the guard who had so often shown me small mercies. "She'll help us," David explained as she scanned the hallway. "Marco contacted her weeks ago. She was waiting for the right moment." I looked at Fatima in wonder. Why? Her eyes were shining, brimming with unshed tears. "Why are you so determined not to give up this foreign faith? Why don't you go home, to your old life?" Fatima looked at me, her English halting but sincere. "Because I've seen what your faith has done for you," she said. "I've seen a peace in you I've never known. Maybe your Jesus is real." There wasn't time for a long conversation, but those words were like a ray of light in the darkness of my prison. Even in that place of suffering, God was at work, touching hearts, planting hope. David handed me a raincoat and a small backpack. "We need to be quick," he warned. "The boat will wait until the storm lets up. After that, it's too dangerous to stay here." We left the cell and began walking down the corridors I knew so well, but which, in that moment, no longer felt like a prison. Now they were the path to freedom. Every step was an act of faith. Every shadow seemed to hide a danger, and every sound made me pray silently. The facility seemed nearly empty. Most of the guards had taken shelter from the storm, and the few who remained seemed more concerned with protecting themselves from the rain than with guarding a prisoner who, to them, was surely trapped in her cell. We reached a side door that led directly to the rocky shore. David took a key from his pocket, clearly borrowed from Fatima, and unlocked the door. As soon as we opened it, we were hit by the sheer force of the storm. The biting wind nearly lifted me off my feet. The rain drenched me in seconds, and the roar of the waves was deafening. David gripped my arm tightly and pointed toward the lagoon, where the flickering lights of a boat bobbed among the choppy waves. "We need to get to the water," he shouted, fighting against the roar of the storm. "There's an inflatable boat waiting." The path to the shore was treacherous. The coral rocks were wet and slippery. The waves crashed relentlessly, and every step demanded my full attention. One slip could mean serious injury, or worse, being swept out to sea. As we walked, I felt the weight of this moment, walking through the storm toward freedom. I was leaving behind not just a cell, but a place that tried to destroy my faith, but actually only strengthened it. "Jesus," I cried out to the wind and rain. "Thank you for not abandoning me. Thank you for sending help." David gave me a curious look, surprised by my gratitude in the midst of my struggle, but I felt more alive than ever. This wasn't just an escape, it was a divine deliverance. Finally, we reached the water's edge, where a small inflatable boat struggled against the waves. 2 men were inside, one piloting the noisy motor, the other holding the boat steady against the current. "Marco!" I heard someone shout, and my heart raced. It was him, my Italian friend, who had personally come to rescue me. David helped me into the boat, and I immediately felt the difference between the solidity of the rock and the unpredictable sway of the water. The boat rose and fell violently with each wave, and I held on with all my strength to keep from being thrown into the raging sea. Marco hugged me quickly, trying to say something that the wind and the noise of the storm made impossible to hear. Even so, his mere presence was an immense comfort, an anchor amidst the chaos. I wasn't alone on this journey. Jesus had sent friends, brothers in faith, who didn't hesitate to risk their own lives to secure my freedom. The crossing to the larger boat was the most terrifying part of my life. Giant waves rose like mountains of water, threatening to capsize our small boat at any moment. The engine struggled with all its might to maintain course, and several times I thought we wouldn't make it. But then, I remembered the stories Marco had told me about Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee. "Teacher, don't you care if we perish?" the disciples cried, and Jesus simply stood up and said, "Hush, be still." I closed my eyes, and with a heavy heart, prayed, "Jesus, please calm this storm. You've done it before. Help us now." I don't know if it was coincidence or a miracle, but in that instant, the engine seemed to gain power, and we finally began to move toward the waiting ship. Climbing from the small boat to the larger ship in the midst of that storm was a true act of faith. I had to jump at the exact moment the waves aligned the two boats, trusting that the hands outstretched to me would reach me. And they did. Steady hands pulled me to the deck, and for the first time in months, I felt safe. The ship was larger, more stable, and even still battling the storm. It felt like a haven compared to the chaos I'd left behind. The crew was made up of Christians of various nationalities, some missionaries, others supporters of the cause of religious freedom. They took me to a small cabin on the lower deck, where I could finally remove my soaking wet clothes and feel the warmth of humankind. Marco sat beside me as the ship cut through the waves, leaving the Maldives behind and entering international waters. "I thought I'd never see you again," he said, his eyes welling up. "When your mother gave you away, I thought all was lost." Inside, I felt guilty. Had all this happened because of me? Was it my message that caused it all? I held onto his hand and whispered, "It wasn't my will. It was God's will." I needed to go through all this to understand how real Jesus is to me. I spoke about the months of interrogation, the attempts to destroy my faith, the silent prayers gazing out at the ocean, and how Jesus sustained me through every moment. Marco looked at me with admiration, amazed at the peace I carried, even after so much suffering. "You're stronger than I thought," he said, half emotionally. "It's not me," I replied. "Jesus is strong in me. That's the difference." As the ship pulled away from the coast toward freedom, I leaned against the window, looking back at the lights fading into the horizon. It was a final farewell. The Maldives, my home for 23 years, was now forbidden territory. But strangely, I didn't just feel sadness. I also felt hope. Jesus promised that those who left home, family, and country for his sake would receive 100-fold in this life and eternal life in the next. I asked Marco, "Where do we go now?" "First, to Sri Lanka," he replied. "We have contacts there who will help you with documents and a place to stay. After that, the world opens up. There are Christian communities everywhere who will welcome you as a sister." I thought of my mother, who was still in Malay, probably facing questions about my escape. And my father. I imagined the weight of shame on him, having a daughter who had abandoned everything for believing in a God they saw as foreign. The pain of rejection still throbbed deeply within me, but it no longer crushed me as it once had. Silently, as the waves finally began to calm, I prayed, "Jesus, please touch my parents' hearts. Help them understand that I have found true love in you, and if it is your will, one day allow us to be reunited." The storm was beginning to subside. As we moved away from the Maldivian waters, the wind died down. The rain turned to a light drizzle, and for the first time in months, the stars began to shine brightly in the sky, peeking timidly through the dispersing clouds. I lay there, wrapped in my coat, until dawn. I watched the sun rise slowly over the ocean, no longer a prison, but an open path to new life. The colors of dawn, golds, pinks, and oranges, painted the sky and water like a silent promise made by the hand of God. Marco came to sit next to me. In a low voice, he asked, "Do you regret it?" I was silent for a while, thinking. I had lost my family, my country, my identity as a Maldivian citizen. I had endured months of imprisonment, interrogations, attempts to break my spirit. I had experienced the pain of betrayal and rejection from those I loved. But despite all this, I had found something much greater, something that surpassed all the losses. I knew Jesus, not as a distant idea, but as a real and transforming presence in my life, a love no prison could contain. a peace no storm could destroy. I looked at him, my voice steady despite the calm sea surrounding us. I have no regrets. I finally found what I've been searching for my whole life, even without knowing it. I've found God. Marco looked at me curiously. What now? I looked to the horizon, where the sun shone ever brighter, illuminating a world full of possibilities. Now I live for him, I replied. I share my story. I help those who seek the truth. I serve the God who loved me even when all seemed lost. 3 days later, we arrived in Colombo, Sri Lanka. The difference was striking. A vibrant city, full of diversity, where Christianity wasn't a crime. For the first time, I could walk the streets with a small cross hanging around my neck, without fear, without looking back, expecting arrest. The local Christian community welcomed me as family. A pastoral couple, the Fernandos, opened their home to me while I processed my refugee documents. Their home was filled with laughter, spontaneous prayer, and a freedom of worship that still seemed like a dream to me. Here, you can be who you truly are, Mrs. Fernando said as she showed me to my room. You can worship freely, read the Bible without fear, pray out loud. You are free. Freedom. A word I was learning to understand in a new way. I used to think freedom was being able to do whatever I wanted. Now I knew true freedom was being who God created me to be, without masks, without fear, without shame. I began working with an organization that helps religious refugees across South Asia. The pain I experienced in the Maldives left deep scars, but it also became a tool God used to reach others. I began sharing my story at churches, conferences, small gatherings, anywhere I could encourage someone. Whenever I told about my conversion, the months on the disciplinary island, and the storm that became my liberation, I saw tears in the audience's eyes. But most importantly, I saw hope. If God could rescue a young Muslim woman from an isolated prison in the middle of the Indian Ocean, he could do anything. 6 months after my escape, I received a call that changed everything. It was an unknown number, but when I answered, a voice on the other end made me freeze. Amina. It was Fatima, the guard who had risked her own life to help me escape. My heart raced. Fatima, are you okay? Have they done something to you? Her voice trembled, but it was firm. They questioned me, but they couldn't prove anything. But Amina, I need to tell you, after you left, I couldn't stop thinking about your peace, the way you spoke of Jesus. I got a Bible. I've been reading about him. My heart nearly stopped. Fatima, my voice was a whisper. I believe, Amina, she said, crying on the other end of the line. I believe in Jesus. I believe he is the Son of God, but I'm afraid. I don't know what to do now. Tears streamed down my face, this time of joy. Fatima, Jesus loves you. He loves you exactly as you are. You don't have to do anything to deserve his love. He's already given it to you. You are not alone. For the next week, we talked every day. I explained the gospel over the phone, prayed with her, and guided her first steps in this new faith. It was like watching a life being born again, and it brought me a joy I hadn't felt since my own conversion. But soon, Fatima too had to flee. Her faith was already overflowing, too real to hide. 6 months later, she arrived in Sri Lanka. When we met at the Colombo airport, we hugged and cried like 2 little girls. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for showing me the way. I smiled through my tears. I didn't do anything, Fatima. It was Jesus. It's always Jesus. Today, 2 years after my escape, I live in a small house on the outskirts of Colombo. I work full-time helping Christian refugees from across South Asia. Fatima is by my side, working with me. We have become a chosen family, united not by blood, but by faith. I still think about my parents. I still love them. I still pray for them every day, asking Jesus to touch their hearts as he touched mine and Fatima's. I know it seems impossible, but I've learned that nothing is impossible for God. Sometimes when I'm alone on a Sri Lankan beach, I look west, at the sea that leads to the Maldives, that paradisiacal archipelago that was once my prison. I no longer feel bitter toward my country, nor toward my mother, who handed me over to the authorities. I understand that she acted out of fear, shaped by years of teaching that saving my soul from error was more important than preserving our relationship. But I also know something she doesn't yet know. I haven't lost my soul. I've found it. I have found true freedom, not slavery. I have found God. I have not abandoned him. The ocean, which once marked the boundary of my prison, is now a reminder of the immensity of God's love. Every wave that crashes on the shore reminds me that his grace is as vast as the waters, as constant as the tides, and as powerful as the storms that can destroy as well as liberate. Marco still visits us from time to time. Now we work together on projects that seek to establish safe churches in places where Christianity is prohibited. It's dangerous work, but necessary. There are so many people, like I once was, seeking the truth in places where truth is considered a crime. Have you ever wondered, what if, Marco asked me during his last visit, what if you had remained silent about your faith? What if you had found a way to be a Christian in secret, without anyone finding out? I considered the question as we walked along the beach at sunset. It would be living a lie, I finally replied. Jesus didn't save me to live in the shadows. He saved me to be light in the darkness. How could I keep something so precious, so transformative to myself? That night, as I do every night, I prayed for the Maldives. I prayed for the young people who, like me years ago, whisper forbidden questions to the wind. I prayed that they would find the courage to seek answers no matter the cost. I prayed that one day this paradise in the Indian Ocean would also become a paradise of religious freedom, and I prayed for my mother. I still long for the day I can call her and say, "Mom, I've found true love. I've found true peace. This love, this peace, has a name, Jesus." Until that day comes, I live each moment as a testimony of what God can do when someone decides to follow him without looking back. My name is no longer Amina, the girl from the Maldives who, as they said, got lost in a foreign religion. I am Anna, daughter of the King of the universe, citizen of the kingdom of heaven. Today, I am a living testament that no prison is too strong, no storm too fierce, and no rejection too deep to hinder the love of Jesus. The truth cost me everything I had, but it gave me something infinitely greater, a new life and eternity with the God who loved me enough to die for me.